Let's go back through that speech. Now, of course, one of the things that is the very rare moments that you get as an opposition leader to be able to be heard in silence, to not be edited up by TV stations who may or may not decide to run you on the evening news. You get three major opportunities between now and the next election. They are the budget in reply. 30 minutes where you can stand up to point out what the problems are for the government, but what you would do as an alternative government. But also, what you saw in Peter Dutton tonight was a recognition that there were mistakes that had been made through the pandemic, that he was willing to be supportive of the things that he agreed with in the budget, because, of course, so much of that last election was a lot of Me Tooing when it comes to policies of reducing things like PBS payments and the rest. But what was interesting was this was an absolute statement of values by Peter Dutton. To those who were watching, who may well have a caricature of Peter Dutton in their head, they saw a guy who got emotional when talking about being a police officer having to deal with domestic violence in Queensland. They saw the emotion that he had when he was talking about the Yazidis. Now, in part, the reason why he mentioned the Yazidis is because, remember, that is the population that was fleeing ISIS. At the same time, this government is about to bring back 40 people who were loyal to the caliphate. Now, they do not have the courage to talk about why they are doing this, but the reality is that the communities where these Yazidi people, the former victims of ISIS, now live, is most likely the place where the brides of the jihadis and their kids will end up returning to. That was a very definite mention of that policy being a wrong thing to do. Also, the preferences and the focus, particularly around things like education, about the basics of what our education system will be. Now, of course, Twitter will hate that and Channel 2 will go crazy. But for normal people, they'll say hallelujah, especially to new migrants to the country who may have come from countries like Singapore, where there's absolute focus on education, but here it's so much about indoctrination. A few things stand out to me that were really impressive about this speech. It was deliberately in presentation low-key because he wanted you to hear what he was saying. He wanted you to see what he believed in. And again, this is the start of a 3-year process. He talked about how the budget that was delivered just a couple of days ago was so much different than what the expectation was when people changed the government a few months ago.
Labor's budget was a missed opportunity to help you at a time when you need help. It didn't address our economic challenges or inspire confidence. It's a budget which breaks promises rather than keeps them. A budget which weakens Australia's financial position rather than strengthens it. And it's a budget which adds to rather than alleviates your cost of living pressures.
Apologies for the chest hair. Peter Dutton was very clear in talking about the economic circumstances that we live in right now. We talk about it every night on the show. You know it here in Port Pirie, you know it wherever you are watching us right now, which is cost of living has got way worse in the past 6 months. Now, Labor spent an awful lot of time talking about a cost of living crisis and how they were going to deal with this, that and the other, but of course all of it's got worse. Inflation has now got a 7 in front of it, which puts us right up there with some of the worst experiences post-COVID in the world. We know that this government's going to spend too much money and, frankly, as their budget showed us on Tuesday, they basically took $1 here and spent $1.05 somewhere else. That's not what our budget needs right now. Here in part is what he had to say, particularly about the cost of living.
On Tuesday, the Treasurer failed to mention in his speech what Labor's budget papers revealed. Everything is going up except your wages. Cost of living, power prices, taxes, interest rates, unemployment and the deficit are going up or will be going up under the government's predictions. The same budget papers confirmed that real wages are forecast to go down. And this means that by Christmas, a typical family will be $2,000 worse off under this budget. So you have every right to be anxious and disappointed because the Prime Minister has broken his faith with you.
And as you know, that promise of $275 power bill cut is not going to happen. In fact, power bills are expected to go up by 50% in the next 2 years. Everyone excited about an extra 50% in the next 2 years? Not exactly what they presented at the election. And of course, he talks very directly about how this government's decision that they signed, that they didn't inherit, their decision to supercharge a brand new electricity grid results in hundreds of billions of dollars that you have to pay.
Labor's push for 82% renewables by 2030 comes without a plan to ensure reliable baseload power. Its policies will see hundreds of billions of dollars spent on rolling out poles and high transmission wires in towns and suburbs. Labor is misleading Australians when it says it can roll out billions of dollars worth of transmission wires, cables and towers for renewable energy in just the next few years. Regional communities and farms will be carpeted with up to 28,000 kilometres of new high-voltage transmission lines. That's almost the entire coastline of mainland Australia, or the distance of travelling from Melbourne to Perth and back 4 times. Every dollar spent on new transmission lines will be paid for by consumers through higher electricity bills.
All of which, of course, has to be built, all of which has to be paid for. As I tell you every night, the CSIRO told us how much it'll cost, $1 trillion. This government has got $20 billion over the next 10 years that they're putting off budget. Now, I didn't do that well at maths at school, but I'm pretty sure that's not the same number. Now, of course, again, as I said, these speeches are about trying to introduce yourself, trying to say to people, hey, OK, look, if you're a fair-minded person, hear me out. And while we heard over and over again about how Anthony Albanese had come from Housing Commission family with a single mother, Peter Dutton's story is one that is similar to millions more of Australians. Of course, a bloke who ended up being a police officer, but the story that he talks about when he talks about his parents is exactly the same as the one that is my parents and no doubt many of the people watching us right now. A reminder about why this bloke is one of us.
My dad, Bruce, started out as a small businessman, as a bricklayer. My mum, Elsa, was a secretary, and by the time 5 kids came along, of which I'm the eldest, Mum was at home raising us and doing the books for Dad. But she also took in local kids as a daycare mum. My parents had a very strong work ethic. They taught us to appreciate the value of money. We were raised with a lot of love and support, but not much money. We lived in what is still a working-class suburb, but from grade 7 until I started university, I worked in a local butcher shop after school and on Saturday mornings, scrubbing floors and washing up and serving on the counter. It was tough work, but it was character building, and it gave me an appreciation for many different perspectives. I saved like crazy. One of my proudest achievements was buying my first home. It was nothing flash at a bit less than $90,000 from memory, but it was mine. And today, of course, it's much, much harder, almost impossible, for many young people to afford their first home, even with hard work, even with sacrifice, and even with savings.